A restless court around the 9th century, beneath the smoky glow of palace lanterns and behind the silk-draped walls of the Tang dynasty's forbidden city, a strange problem was stirring in the inner chambers. The emperor could not sleep. It might sound trivial, but insomnia in the imperial court wasn't just a personal discomfort. It was a national concern. An unrested emperor made slow decisions. He issued poorly timed edicts. And worse, insomnia was seen as a sign of imbalance between heaven and earth, something that could end dynasties. That's how a minor disturbance in one man's sleep routine became a matter of national medicine, spiritual realignment, and curious inventions, like the famous Jade pillow. You might be picturing a smooth, cool slab of stone, and you wouldn't be far off. In many ancient Chinese traditions, jade was thought to hold more than material value. It wasn't merely decoration. Jade was believed to have life force energy, or qi, capable of influencing both body and mind. To the Taoist physicians and Confucian advisors surrounding the emperor, jade wasn't just a gemstone. It was medicine, protection, and harmony distilled into stone. So how did a piece of rock end up on the emperor's bed? To understand that, you have to look at the Chinese theory of yin and yang. Everything, day and night, hot and cold, male and female, was part of a delicate universal balance. The emperor's insomnia was diagnosed as a yang imbalance. Too much mental heat, too much stimulation. The cure? A cooling object that could draw the heat out of the body during rest. Enter the jade pillow. These were not soft headrests. In fact, they were hard, rectangular blocks carved with inscriptions, sometimes shaped like resting animals, tigers, or dragons, designed to cradle the skull while cooling the brain. It might not sound restful to you now, but to a 9th century physician, this was cutting-edge therapy. But here's the most curious part. The emperor was not alone. Historical records, especially from the Zhuli, Rites of Zhou, and Tang court logs, show that many nobles used these pillows, not just for comfort, but for specific medical purposes. There were jade pillows for balancing the gallbladder, for calming racing thoughts, even ones infused with scents like sandalwood or cloves, which were stored inside hidden cavities. Some were engraved with Taoist prayers. Others were passed down as heirlooms, rumoured to carry the spirit of past rulers. The imperial sleep chambers were less like bedrooms and more like therapeutic observatories. Assistants would monitor the emperor's breath, temperature, and sleep posture. If he stirred too often or spoke in his sleep, reports would be filed. Scholars debated whether to alter his tea regimen. The palace kitchen adjusted herbs. The royal astrologers consulted the stars to see whether celestial alignment was contributing to sleeplessness. Sleep, in short, was a political concern. So what did the emperor himself think? Diaries of Emperor Xuanzong, R. 712-756, written in poetic fragments and translated centuries later, reveal a man troubled by more than just noisy thoughts. He spoke of ghosts visiting him in the dark, of dreams filled with rivers that flowed backward, and of the suffocating pressure of too many voices in my crown. His physicians prescribed more jade, more prayer, more stillness. But still, sleep eluded him. Some historians believe this obsession with sleep purity contributed to stricter palace routines. Curtains were soaked in chrysanthemum tea to calm the air. Bamboo mats were replaced twice daily. Whispering became mandatory in the evening. Court musicians were tasked with composing lullabies based on ancient pentatonic scales believed to soothe the soul. And always, the jade pillow was there, cool, against the neck, heavy with expectation. You may wonder why such a rich and powerful man couldn't simply buy peace. But peace, as the ancient texts say, is a matter of alignment, not possession. The emperor had everything, but balance, it seems, cannot be purchased. And as night after night passed in restless silence, one quiet question began to spread among the palace staff. If even the Son of Heaven cannot sleep, what hope is there for the rest of us? Jade, spirit, and the battle for sleep. By the time Emperor Xuanzong's sleeplessness had persisted through multiple lunar cycles, The palace physicians began escalating their approach. Their scrolls of ancient remedies were unrolled, each inked with hundreds of treatments from the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's inner canon, China's oldest medical text. It outlined the belief that the human body was a miniature universe, ruled by energy meridians, elemental forces, and imbalances that disrupted the body's harmony. And in Xuanzong's case, the imbalance had settled in the mind. A team of imperial physicians, equal parts herbalists, acupuncturists, astrologers and scholars, gathered near the Hall of Heavenly Calm. Their goal, to restore sleep not just as a bodily function, but as a spiritual necessity. More jade was ordered. Jade was sourced from the far western mountains, what is now Xinjiang province. Caravans brought blocks of nephrite and serpentine, which were deemed coolest to the touch. These stones would be carved into new pillow shapes, crescent for neck alignment, rectangular for pressure relief, even ones with grooves to cradle the ears and temples. But the most expensive pillow wasn't shaped for comfort. It was engraved for power. Its surface was inscribed with lines from the Tao Te Ching, a foundational Taoist text written by Laozi. It read, "Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. Be still. Be silent. Be soft like water." The pillow was thought to transfer these teachings directly into the sleeping mind. And yet, the emperor remained awake. Desperate for results, one physician turned to an ancient and rarely practiced method, dream diagnosis. This wasn't fortune-telling. It was the belief that dreams were messages from the organs. A dream of fire might suggest an overheated liver. A dream of floating could signal spleen weakness. And Xuanzong's repeated dreams of reversing rivers? That was deeply troubling. According to Taoist belief, such dreams signified counterflow, qi, the energy moving against its proper direction. Qi was supposed to descend at night, cooling the body and quieting the mind. But in Xuanzong's case, it seemed to rise, agitating the heart, fueling overthinking and disturbing dreams. So the palace implemented a new regimen. A jade pillow was chilled each evening in water scented with lotus root. The emperor was fed boiled barley broth before bed, a cooling grain. A massage expert was brought from Nanyang to apply acupressure along the Shenmen point on the ear and the yintang between the brows. The chamber's torches were extinguished earlier. Even the color scheme of the emperor's sleeping robes was changed, from red silk, a fiery color, to muted blue and green, symbolizing water and wood, which cool fire in five-element theory. Still, sleep came in fragments. Some whispered that the emperor's soul was disturbed. Others blamed political unrest, internal court rivalries that kept him restless at night. Several eunuchs swore they saw him walking the halls at midnight, muttering fragments of poetry, touching the walls with his fingers as if searching for something long lost. It was at this point that one of his closest attendants, an elderly scholar named Jian Ru, made a controversial suggestion. Perhaps it wasn't the emperor's body that was unwell, but the palace itself. In ancient Chinese feng shui thought, buildings were like living organisms. Their alignment, shape, and layout could nourish or disturb the humans within them. Jianru believed that the sleeping chamber was built on an ill-aligned energy point, an imbalance of earth qi. The solution? Move the sleeping quarters to a different wing of the palace, one facing the west garden, where the wind was softer and the ground less strained by ancestral spirits. To the surprise of many, the emperor agreed. Within days, a modest chamber was prepared. Lower ceilings, bamboo floor mats, and a simpler jade pillow, this one unadorned, undecorated, perfectly smooth. The shift to minimalism was intentional. In Taoist thought, too many objects disrupt rest. Emptiness is peace. And in this quiet, stripped-down room, something shifted. The emperor reported a short nap, then a full night's sleep. The court rejoiced. The pillow was honored. Poets compared it to the moon, cold, heavy, silent, and faithful. It was given a name, the stone that silenced thought. But of course, the story doesn't end there, because the night after his first full rest, Xuanzong awoke with a start. He claimed he had seen a shadow at the edge of his dreams. It wasn't frightening, just familiar and distant. He described it as a figure wearing the robes of a former emperor, but with the eyes of a peasant child. His attendants documented this detail with care. No one knew what it meant. But once again, the emperor's sleep became shallow. Historians today debate what really plagued Emperor Xuanzong's mind. Some say it was simply the stress of rule. Others point to guilt over lost wars, over policies that hurt the peasantry, or over his infamous love affair with young Guifei, whose death had shaken him deeply. Was the jade pillow a solution, or just a beautifully carved stone absorbing centuries of dreams? And if sleep is, as the ancients believed, the truest form of honesty, what does it mean when a man cannot rest even on jade? The stone that remembered, the third and final act of Emperor Xuanzong's struggle with sleep did not begin in a palace, but in a tomb. 50 years after his death, when archaeologists opened a buried Tang dynasty crypt in what is now Shanxi province, they discovered an unremarkable burial site with one peculiar object nestled under the skull of the occupant, a perfectly preserved jade pillow, smooth, uncarved, slightly concave to fit the curve of a neck, pale green with faint veins of white, running through its body like frozen smoke under glass. Etched faintly into one side, almost invisible, was a phrase in early Tang calligraphy. It read, "He who carries burdens must rest where the earth is quiet." There is no official confirmation that the body was Emperor Xuanzong's. The records are ambiguous, but the timing, location, and the style of the jade suggest a noble figure, perhaps even royalty. More importantly, this pillow marked the continuation of a philosophy that had quietly embedded itself in the imperial psyche long after Xuanzong's final restless night. Because while sleep returned to him in occasional waves, true peace remained elusive. In the years following his mysterious dream of the robed figure with peasant eyes, the emperor's nights settled into something resembling acceptance. Not full rest, not deep slumber, but short intervals, small islands of calm between storms of thought. And he began to write. The fragments of these writings, later compiled into the Moon Ledger, detail an old man no longer seeking perfect sleep, but rather understanding why sleep had left him. He described sleep as a guest, not a right, and insomnia as a whisper of what we've chosen not to hear in daylight. One entry reads, "I once blamed the pillow, then the tea, then the stars. But now I wonder, what if the stillness frightens me because it speaks too clearly of my time left?" In these pages we see a shift, from jade as a tool to jade as a witness. By the time jade pillows became commonplace among the nobility in the Song dynasty, 960–1279, they were no longer simply cooling devices or spiritual objects. They became heirlooms of worry, passed down from father to son, not for better sleep, but as reminders that even emperors must learn to live with unrest. Many of these pillows were buried with their owners, seen as bridges to the dream world, the realm between the living and the dead. Taoist monks began recording stories of people who could communicate with ancestors through dreams induced by jade rest. Some even claimed that certain stones were haunted, not by ghosts, but by residual thoughts, the mental impressions of those who used them nightly for decades. And still, jade pillows remained popular. Why? Because they were beautiful. They were symbolic. They were quiet company. You may ask yourself, how could a hard stone be comforting? But consider this. We comfort ourselves today with screens, with noise, with distractions. The ancients sought comfort in stillness, in wait, in the cool certainty of a mineral that had witnessed time far longer than any dynasty. Xuanzong's legacy, then, is not that he slept well, but that he searched for sleep with sincerity. His jade pillow became a metaphor for governance, beautiful, cold, inflexible, and designed with care. yet still unable to silence the mind. His empire survived him, but only just. His heart broke from grief, his policies wavered in old age, and yet his longing for sleep stayed constant, a quiet battle beneath the roaring theatre of rule. Modern sleep science would offer him no jade, but perhaps melatonin, CBT therapy, meditation apps. Yet even these carry the same question. Can anything truly silence the mind of someone who carries the weight of millions? As you lay your own head down tonight, perhaps on something softer than a nephrite stone, consider the quiet endurance of a man who ruled from golden thrones, but envied the dreams of farmers. And in the stillness between your thoughts, ask yourself, is sleep something we earn, or something we learn to surrender to? Why Roman senators slept with garlic under their pillows. The scent of authority. You likely think of ancient Rome as a place of power and conquest, gleaming togas, marble columns, and the roar of the Colosseum. But after the crowds dispersed, after the orators finished their grand speeches and the wine-soaked feast drew to a close, the Roman elite, senators, generals, and scholars returned to their private domus homes and prepared for sleep in a surprisingly pungent way. They placed garlic cloves under their pillows. It seems absurd at first. Garlic, with its sharp, acrid smell, doesn't exactly conjure images of serenity. And yet, in ancient Roman households, especially among the governing class, garlic was more than food. It was medicine. It was magic. And in some strange way, it was protection from fear. You see, even the powerful were afraid of the dark. The Roman night was not gentle. No streetlights. No quiet neighborhoods. Night was full of stray dogs, thieves, howling winds, and the ever-present fear of the lemures, the malevolent spirits of the unburied dead. Romans believed that these vengeful ghosts wandered the streets in silence, slipping through cracks and doorways, draining vitality from the living, especially while they slept. To combat this, they developed bedtime rituals that were part superstition, part health practice, and entirely Roman in their stubborn pragmatism. And so, garlic under the pillow. According to Pliny the Elder, Rome's famous naturalist and encyclopedist, garlic was a divine gift from the earth itself. In his Natural History, he writes, "Garlic, by its scent alone, repels noxious air, unclean spirits, and sickness. It arouses the heart and fortifies the mind." It was not just a food, it was a boundary. We now know that garlic contains alicin, a compound with antibacterial properties. But the Romans didn't need chemistry to convince them. They saw it work on wounds, on infections, on parasites. If garlic could drive out worms from the gut, surely it could drive out spirits from the room. And so began the custom. Roman senators, especially the aging ones, were known to follow strict pre-sleep routines. They would bathe in lukewarm water, anoint their foreheads with olive oil, and place 1 or 2 cloves of garlic beneath their cushions. Not just any garlic, Allium sativum grown on specific soils, preferably from Apulia or Hispania, believed to be strongest in smell and therefore spirit repellent. The bedchamber of a senator was not luxurious by modern standards. A simple wooden frame, woolen sheets, and a hard mattress. Above the door, protective charms. Beside the bed, sometimes a bronze figurine of Mercury or Janus, facing both directions, to watch for intruders, human or otherwise. And under the pillow, the garlic. The scent was considered fortifying, a word the Romans used often in health philosophy. A fortifying aroma, a fortifying diet, a fortifying mindset. Senators believed that good decisions by day required strong rest by night, and that sleep was a kind of temporary death that required defense. There are records of senators dreaming vividly while under the garlic's influence. One, preserved in the lesser-known Insomnia Romana, described an old statesman dreaming that his enemies could no longer speak in court because garlic fumes sealed their lips. Another wrote that he dreamed of walking through Elysium, followed closely by an unseen presence, until he turned and saw a glowing garlic bulb floating behind him like a torch. Of course, not all senators were true believers. Cicero, the famed orator, is known to have mocked the practice in letters to Atticus, calling garlic the perfume of the desperate. Yet even he admitted to keeping cloves on hand during particularly tense nights, especially when he feared political betrayal or illness. Garlic, after all, was considered more than protection against the supernatural. It was also a preventative for melancholia, a condition we might now equate with anxiety or depression. Roman medical theory, heavily influenced by the Greeks, categorized illnesses by the imbalance of humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Melancholia came from too much black bile, cold, heavy, stagnant. Garlic was believed to be hot and dry in nature, perfect for counteracting that weight. Placing it near the head, where thoughts were formed, was thought to stimulate the mind, warm the spirit, and keep darkness at bay. And then there was the soldier connection. Roman soldiers consumed garlic before battle, not for strength alone, but for courage. The term animus, spirit, soul, will, was associated with breath. A strong breath, fueled by garlic, was believed to embolden the animus. Senators, many of whom were former generals or deeply tied to military tradition, saw garlic as a way to sleep with bravery, to rest without fear, to rise without doubt. So night after night, the garlic remained, sometimes fresh, sometimes roasted slightly over flame to release its inner heat, always placed beneath linen, never in direct contact with the skin. Too sharp, they believed. Some mixed it with lavender or thyme to moderate the aroma. Others let the scent dominate. The stronger, the better. But what's most fascinating is what they feared the most: losing clarity of mind. The greatest Roman shame wasn't poverty nor illness. It was madness, delirium, night terrors, sleep that disturbed rather than restored. And garlic, pungent and grounding, was the humble tool to fend off the descent into confusion. As Rome grew more chaotic in its later centuries, with emperors rising and falling at dizzying speeds, these bedtime rituals became almost sacred. Garlic was sold in sleep markets. Dream interpreters asked whether you'd used garlic the night before, and some temples even offered pillows stuffed with dried garlic skin for priests suffering insomnia. But even garlic has limits. In the final years of the Republic, when the city became a place of assassinations, civil wars, and burning forums, some whispered that garlic had lost its power, that the lemures had grown too many, that the night, once merely superstitious, had become truly dangerous. And so, an eerie question began spreading through Rome's aging senators. If garlic no longer wards off the night, what will? Warding off the darkness as the Roman Republic transitioned into the Roman Empire, sleep became an increasingly fragile thing, especially for those who held power. Assassinations crept like shadows into the very bedrooms of the elite. Night was no longer metaphorically dangerous, it was politically fatal. And so garlic, that humble, reeking clove, began to carry more weight than ever before. It was no longer just a charm, it became a symbol of resistance. Senators who clung to the old traditions of the Republic also clung to their garlic-scented rituals. Even as emperors demanded loyalty oaths and eliminated dissent with quiet executions, many patrician families kept up the nightly placement of garlic beneath the pillow, not just to banish nightmares, but to honor what they called mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors. Garlic, pungent and persistent, reminded them of the stubborn virtues Rome was built upon. In private homes, you'd often find other elements joining garlic in these quiet rituals. Small iron knives placed under mattresses, not for use, but for symbolic protection. Bowls of salt near the window, laurel leaves on the threshold, but garlic always was key. One senator's will from the 1st century BCE even dictated that his sons keep the scent of virtue near their heads at night, as I did in life. You may ask, how did these seemingly silly habits persist? Because even as medicine inched forward, through Galen's vast writings and Hippocratic theories imported from Greece, the fear of the invisible never left the Roman psyche, and few things were more invisible and more feared than sleep paralysis. The Romans didn't have a name for it, but they described it often: waking in the dark, unable to move, feeling a presence pressing on the chest. They attributed this to the incubus, a night demon that crept in through cracks in walls or open windows. It was especially feared among the elderly, those whose bodies were slow to respond and whose minds drifted often between memory and sleep. Garlic was believed to drive the incubus away. In fact, Roman folk medicine eventually went beyond mere placement under the pillow. Some physicians recommended rubbing garlic directly on the soles of the feet before bed, believing it would draw the blood downward and prevent excessive dreaming. Others suggested chewing a clove just before lying down to guard the breath. There was even a short-lived trend in which wealthy Romans commissioned garlic pillows, actual cushions filled with dried garlic skin, fennel, and crushed laurel leaves. They were never mass-produced, too expensive, too smelly. But for those who could afford them, these pillows were said to induce dreams of clarity. Useful, perhaps, in a time when knowing whom to trust could mean the difference between surviving the night or not. Meanwhile, those in lower classes adopted garlic in their own way. Labourers believed sleeping with garlic nearby kept the joints from stiffening. Tavern workers, exposed to all manner of nightly mischief, hung braided, garlic above their bunks to protect against curses whispered by drunkards. Even gladiators in the barracks of the Ludus Magnus were rumoured to rub garlic oil on their temples before sleeping, claiming it gave them courage in their dreams. But among senators, the symbolism was heavier. After the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, a strange rumour circulated that one of the senators who participated in the plot, Decimus Brutus, had skipped his garlic ritual the night before. According to a later telling in the Historia Augusta, he had a nightmare in which Caesar's toga bled through the floor and filled the room with the scent of crushed herbs. He awoke shaken and omitted his usual clove under the pillow. Whether the story is true hardly matters. Romans told it because it felt true. For them, sleep was not passive. It was political. It revealed secrets, exposed guilt, sharpened or dulled the will. And garlic, simple, ugly, enduring, became a kind of anchor to the waking world. Even emperors eventually took notice. Augustus, the first emperor, was famously obsessed with routine. He kept to strict sleep hours and reportedly had a slave, whose sole job was to prepare his bedchamber. Garlic was not part of his routine, but he tolerated it, perhaps understanding that the appearance of control mattered more than belief. Later emperors, like Claudius, were said to use garlic oil for ear infections and indigestion, but its sleep use remained a primarily senatorial tradition. In the 2nd century CE, as Rome's bureaucracy swelled and the Senate's actual power waned, so did the symbolism of garlic begin to fade. The younger generation laughed at it. They called it peasant perfume. Physicians began promoting imported remedies, Persian opiates, Egyptian incenses, herbal tonics from Gaul. But some old senators still clung to the garlic ritual, less for sleep and more for memory. To them, placing garlic under the pillow was like lighting a small flame in the dark, a statement that they remembered when Rome was governed by debate instead of decree, when ghosts were fought off not by secret police but by conviction and cloves. And then there were those who placed it without belief, simply because their fathers had. A ritual without certainty, but still performed, because in a world where gods and emperors changed often, it helped to hold on to something that didn't. Still, one question lingered, whispered only among chamber walls. If even garlic could not protect the dreams of Rome's most powerful men, then what, if anything, could protect their legacy? The last sleep of the Republic. As the centuries rolled forward and the marble of the Senate House began to crack, the rituals of Rome's aging elite, like the empire itself, began to drift into memory. By the 4th century CE, much of the garlic sleep, Tradition had become a whispered custom, practiced more in rural villas than in the grand estates of Rome's increasingly Christian nobility. The empire had split by then, and the Western Roman Empire was slowly crumbling under its own weight, under invasions, overextension, and the decay of institutions once held sacred. Still, in dusty corners of Italy, in weathered homes that once belonged to senators, one might still find a simple linen pouch filled with garlic skins, tucked under the corner of a bed. They weren't used by powerful men anymore, but by their widows, their sons, their servants. The symbolism had changed, softened. Garlic was no longer a bulwark against political assassination or vengeful spirits. It had become a relic of comfort, a sensory memory of a father's habits, a grandfather's smell. The rituals had outlived the reasons. And that, perhaps, is the quiet power of ancient belief. It lingers, even when forgotten. One of the last records we have of a senator's garlic ritual comes from a private letter dated around 408 CE. It was penned by a noblewoman named Proba, who had fled to the countryside during the Visigothic siege of Rome. In a message to her cousin in Ravenna, she wrote, "I cannot sleep here, though the fields are quiet and the house is strong. Last night I found one of father's old sachets. The linen is yellowed, but the scent remained. I placed it beneath my pillow. For the first time in many nights, the dark passed gently. There's no magic in that moment, no ghosts driven off, no spirits confronted, just a human being, afraid and far from home, finding comfort in a practice older than memory." By the fall of the Western Empire in 476 CE, garlic had returned fully to its role as food and medicine. Its use as a sleep protector disappeared from formal writings, only to re-emerge centuries later in bits of medieval folklore. But those Roman senators, those men who debated laws by day and feared their dreams by night, had left behind something curious. They taught the world that the mind, even in power, is never fully at rest, and garlic, simple, sharp, common, was their chosen shield. Against ghosts, against guilt, against the weight of decisions that could not be undone once darkness fell. Modern sleep science, of course, offers no support for garlic's powers. But even today, some cultures still tuck cloves into pillowcases. Not because it works, but because someone once believed it did. We wrap ourselves in these old habits not for their truth, but for their comfort. Because the night still comes, and sometimes, even today, the brain spins like a Roman chariot long after the lights go out. The fears may be different: taxes, news alerts, missed deadlines, but the instinct remains the same. Protect the mind at rest. So if tonight your sleep feels uneasy and you've tried the teas and the apps and the silence, consider reaching for something older, maybe even something pungent. Not because it's rational, but because it's human. And as you close your eyes, imagine a marble chamber lit by flickering oil lamps, the scent of garlic mixing with ink and wax. As a senator places one last clove beneath his pillow and whispers into the dark, "May Rome sleep well tonight, and may I wake with courage." The medieval sleep schedule, first sleep, second sleep, and why they believed it worked. Dividing the darkness. Imagine yourself in a modest medieval cottage sometime around the year 1250. The fire has burned low. The wooden shutters are closed, tight against the wind. The straw-stuffed mattress is scratchy, but warm beneath layers of wool and linen. A candle flickers nearby, not to illuminate reading or study, but simply to mark the edge of night. And as your body sinks into rest, you're not aiming to sleep through the entire night. Instead, you're entering first sleep, the beginning of a two-part slumber that was, for hundreds of years, considered the proper and natural way to rest. This idea might seem strange to us now. In the modern world, we chase 8 uninterrupted hours, aided by blackout curtains and digital clocks. But in pre-industrial Europe, the night wasn't a single long stretch of unconsciousness. It was divided by habit, by necessity, and by belief. Sleep historians, yes, there are such scholars, call this pattern biphasic sleep. It's one of the most widespread forgotten habits in human history. Here's how it worked. People went to bed shortly after sunset, often within 2 hours of dusk. That marked the beginning of first sleep. It typically lasted from about 9 p.m. to midnight or a little later, a deep, restorative period of slumber. Then, most people woke up, not startled or groggy, but as if on cue. This middle-of-the-night wakefulness lasted anywhere from 1 to 2 hours and was seen not as a disruption, but a normal and even productive part of the night. During this time, often referred to as the watching or the quiet wake, people engaged in a range of nighttime activities. Some prayed or meditated. Others rose to tend to livestock, check the fire, or use the chamber pot. A few even visited neighbors, conducted quiet chores, or, in wealthier homes, read by candlelight. Couples often used this time for intimacy. In fact, some medieval physicians even recommended it as the healthiest time for conception, believing the body was rested but not yet dulled by deeper sleep. Then, sometime between 1:30 and 2:30 a.m., people returned to bed and entered second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This two-part sleep structure was so normal that it appeared everywhere, in medical texts, legal documents, and personal diaries. In 15th century France, one legal testimony even included a timeline of events that mentioned between first and second sleep as a specific, understood time of night. The idea wasn't unique to Europe either. Records show similar patterns in other pre-industrial cultures, from West Africa to the Middle East. Wherever artificial lighting was scarce and circadian rhythms were guided more by firelight and moonlight than by clocks and schedules. So why did this system make sense? To the medieval mind, night was not a uniform block of unconsciousness. It was a fluid, spiritual landscape. Many believed the soul wandered during sleep, and the time between sleeps was an opportunity to reconnect with the physical world. Dreams were recorded and interpreted. Worries were whispered into prayer. Stories were told quietly by the hearth, not to pass time, but to honor it. Religious orders, especially monks, institutionalized this rhythm. The divine office, the structured prayer routine of monastic life, included vigils, typically scheduled during the quiet hours of the night. Monks would wake intentionally after their first sleep to chant psalms, read scripture, and meditate in near darkness. Even in urban areas, people adhered to this rhythm. City guards patrolled, bakers began work in those liminal hours, and some inns remained open for quiet travelers passing through, acknowledging that movement and life continued even in the deepest parts of the night. Of course, not everyone used their wakeful time the same way. In poorer households, the hours between sleeps might have been used simply to stoke the fire or curl around children to share body heat. In wealthier homes, some used the time to write, candlelight casting long shadows on vellum pages as they copied texts or drafted letters. Doctors of the period noted the benefits of biphasic sleep. The 13th century English physician Gilbertus Anglicus wrote that sleep must come in 2 parts, lest the humours of the body grow stagnant. They believed the waking interval allowed the internal balance of fluids, blood, phlegm, bile, to shift and settle. But there was something else in those dark hours, something quieter. Accounts from diaries and letters often describe the time between first and second sleep as peaceful, even sacred. It was a time free from obligation, untouched by sun or schedule. A space where thoughts softened, words slowed, and the world felt distant but kind. In an illuminated manuscript housed in the Bodleian Library, a monk wrote, "In the silence 'tween sleeps, the mind walks gently, as one who strolls through fog without fear." It was, in some sense, the most human time of day. Not working, not dreaming, just being. But you may be wondering, what happened to this rhythm? Why did we stop? That's a question for the next section. One tied to clocks, capitalism, and the invention of something we take for granted every single night, the light bulb. The death of midnight wakefulness. As the sun rose on the early modern period, roughly the 16th to 18th centuries, so too did a new kind of sleep expectation, one long, unbroken stretch. Slowly, and almost invisibly at first, the once normal rhythm of first and second sleep began to unravel, and the cause wasn't sudden or sinister. It was gradual, boring even. It began with light. In medieval villages, nighttime was governed by fire, candles, hearths, torches. These sources flickered, offered little reach, and were expensive to maintain. A candle could cost a day's wage. A well-trimmed lamp was a sign of status. Most families hoarded tallow and beeswax like treasure. Light, in essence, discouraged wakefulness. But by the late 1600s, cities like London and Paris began installing public street lamps. First oil, then gas. Suddenly, the darkness didn't feel so vast. Streets became safer, taverns stayed open later, and in wealthier homes, advances in oil lamp design allowed for more affordable interior lighting. Night no longer demanded sleep. It invited activity. Soon, after came clocks, the precision of timekeeping, once the domain of monasteries, became accessible to ordinary households. People no longer measured their sleep in natural rhythms, but in hours. And hours, unlike dreams, could be bought, scheduled, and squeezed. Productivity became a virtue. Staying awake became noble. Enter the Industrial Revolution. Factories did not run on moonlight. They ran on shifts. Employers demanded workers who could stay alert and focused from early morning into the evening. Sleep, once divided into two flexible parts, was now expected to happen all at once. A block of unconsciousness squeezed between two bells. Rest was no longer about harmony. It was about efficiency. Waking up in the middle of the night, once a spiritual or reflective activity, became an inconvenience, an annoyance, a disorder. In fact, by the 19th century, medical texts began referring to middle insomnia, the habit of waking up at night, as a pathology, something to be corrected. Herbal tonics were marketed to keep the body down through the entire night. Doctors urged patients to avoid naps, quiet their minds, and strive for a single, continuous sleep. The invention of the electric light bulb in the late 19th century sealed the deal. Artificial light extended the day indefinitely. No longer tied to sun or fire, people could work late, read late, dine late. Bedtimes drifted later and later, and mornings arrived earlier, especially for factory workers. The gentle valley between sleeps was flattened into a single stretch of unconsciousness. By the early 20th century, few remembered the concept of segmented sleep. The phrase first sleep vanished from writing. Second sleep became meaningless. The midnight hours, once alive with prayer, poetry, and whispered thought, were now expected to be silent and still. But the body remembered. Even today, many people wake up in the middle of the night naturally, often without knowing why. Some stare at the ceiling, frustrated. Others reach for their phones. A few may even get up, wander to the kitchen, or sit in quiet thought. They might call it insomnia, or anxiety, or just a bad night. But sleep historians suggest something else. This may be a biological echo, a whisper from a time when waking at midnight wasn't a problem. It was part of being human. In 2001, historian Roger E. Kirch published a landmark study compiling over 500 historical references to biphasic sleep. He found them in court records, diaries, medical manuals, even fiction. One 17th century English ballad includes the line, "I rose from my first sleep and walked with the moon." These weren't rare accounts. They were ordinary. Kirch argued that the consolidated 8-hour sleep we now consider normal is a modern invention, not a biological truth. For most of history, people woke up at night on purpose. This research, once considered obscure, began to influence how sleep scientists understood nocturnal rhythms. In studies where modern volunteers were kept away from artificial light and let their bodies sleep naturally, many returned to a two-phase pattern. First sleep, then a wakeful period, then second sleep. Their reports echoed the past. The time between sleeps wasn't anxious, it was calm. A time of quiet wakefulness, as if the mind was finally allowed to stretch its legs before returning to rest. So what do we do with this forgotten truth? Today's world isn't built for segmented sleep. Most jobs demand early mornings, most social lives lean into late nights, and most of us, when we wake up at 2 a.m., do not feel like strolling through a moonlit garden or reciting psalms by candlelight. But perhaps we can reframe those moments. Perhaps the next time you stir in the middle of the night, instead of reaching for frustration, you could reach for curiosity. What if your body isn't broken, but remembering? What if this gentle wakefulness is not an error, but a pause, a space between dreams where thoughts can breathe? And if that's true, what then was lost when we gave up the second sleep? A forgotten rhythm. Reawakens, as we enter the final part of our story, we're left with a peculiar truth. For centuries, people around the world divided their sleep without ever thinking it was strange. And now, when many wake up in the middle of the night, they wonder what's wrong with them. Perhaps it's not insomnia. Perhaps it's history knocking gently on the door of your mind. The waning of segmented sleep was never marked by a grand event. No emperor banned it. No law forbade it. It simply faded, like so many natural rhythms do, when convenience and invention push their way into habit. But echoes remain. In the 20th century, anthropologists studying tribal groups in Madagascar, Nigeria, and Central America noted something strange. Many of these cultures still practiced biphasic sleep, particularly in agricultural communities where electric lighting was sparse. Their nights mirrored those of medieval peasants. A long nap after dusk, a period of wakeful activity around midnight, and a return to rest until dawn. No one told them to do this. They just did. Why? Because the body wants it. Sleep studies have shown that when left to their own devices, people in environments free from artificial light naturally begin to adopt two-phase sleep again. In one famous experiment, participants placed in a dark room for 14 hours each night to mimic pre-industrial winter darkness began to sleep in two distinct blocks, separated by a 1 to 2 hour period of quiet wakefulness. They reported feeling less anxious, more rested, and more at peace. During that waking period, they weren't stressed or restless. They were calm. Some prayed. Others thought. A few wrote. Most simply, sat in stillness. Isn't that what we long for now? In a world that chases productivity and quantifies rest into sleep scores, we may have forgotten what it means to simply exist in the night. To treat the dark not as an interruption to our lives, but as a different kind of life altogether. Slow, soft, and reflective. The medieval people, for all their hardships, understood something modern science is only beginning to rediscover. Not all wakefulness is bad, and not all sleep is one long line. Sometimes sleep is a wave, cresting into dreams, retreating into quiet, then rolling back once more into rest. This view opens the door to gentler nights. It means that waking up at 2 a.m. doesn't have to mean something is wrong. It could mean your body is remembering how humans have slept for most of history, in 2 acts, like a well-paced story. And what did people do in that quiet intermission? They prayed, they read, they listened to the wind, they whispered secrets to their loved ones. They sat by the fire and tended to their thoughts like small flickering flames. They didn't rush back to sleep. They let it return on its own, like a tide that always knows its way. In a monastery in southern France, one ancient sleep manual offers this advice for the time between rests. Rise not in haste, let the breath settle, touch nothing sharp or cold. Speak only if the room is listening. That line may seem poetic, but it's also profoundly practical. The time between first and second sleep was not about doing, it was about being. So the next time your eyes open in the night, instead of reaching for your phone or checking the clock, try this. Do nothing. Listen to your own breath. Let your thoughts walk unhurriedly through the corridors of your mind. Sit in the company of darkness. And then, when you feel it, slip back into second sleep like the countless souls before you. Because in the end, the night is not an enemy to conquer. It's a landscape to move through, and our ancestors, without gadgets or guides, knew how to walk it better than we do, and in their rhythm, we might still find rest. Nap like a pharaoh, sleep temples and dream oracles of ancient Egypt. When sleep was sacred, long before alarm clocks and sleep studies, before caffeine-fueled mornings and melatonin-laced evenings, there was a civilization that did something quite unexpected with sleep. They worshipped it. In ancient Egypt, the land of pyramids, river gods, and sunlit rituals, sleep wasn't merely a time for rest. It was considered a gateway, a realm between life and death, between the known and the divine. And within this world of temples and sand, there existed a quiet, extraordinary practice now nearly forgotten: the sleep temples. These weren't metaphorical places. They were real, physical locations, carved from stone and mud brick, scattered throughout the Nile Valley, known as houses of life or temples of healing. They were designed not for worship in the conventional sense, but for sleeping with purpose. To understand how this worked, picture the process known as incubation. An afflicted person, someone suffering from an ailment of the body, or more often of the mind, would come to one of these temples. They might travel days across desert terrain, bringing offerings of bread, beer, linen, or incense. Upon arrival, they would speak to a priest, not just a religious figure, but a trained dream interpreter and healer. The patient would then undergo purification, a ritual bath in cool water, a fumigation with fragrant herbs, a recitation of protective spells. This wasn't mere ceremony, it was preparation. The goal was to calm the body, clear the mind, and prepare the soul for divine visitation. Because the hope was this: that during sleep, the gods would appear in dreams. And not just any gods. In most sleep temples, the central figure was Imhotep, the deified architect and physician of the Old Kingdom. Revered as a sage, healer, and later as a god of medicine, Imhotep was believed to send messages through dreams, offering diagnoses, cures, or spiritual insight. So the patient would be led to a sleeping chamber, often a small enclosed room deep within the temple complex. The air would be thick with incense, oil lamps would burn low, soft chanting might echo in the background, and there, wrapped in linen, on a bed of woven reeds or a cool stone slab, they would lie down and wait. Not for sleep alone, but for a vision. Ancient Egyptian records, etched into temple walls and papyri, describe people dreaming of snakes coiled around their legs, interpreted as signs of intestinal healing. Others dreamed of being touched by a glowing hand, or hearing whispers in an unknown tongue. The priests, trained in the symbols of dreams, would decode these visions the following day. One inscription from a sleep temple near Memphis reads, "He came to the temple blind. He slept in the arms of Imhotep, and in the dream, the god placed a lotus upon his eyes. He awoke with sight." Of course, we have no way to verify the truth of such miracles. But to the Egyptians, dreams were messages from the gods, not illusions or random firings of the brain. They believed that during sleep, the soul, known as the Ba, left the body and traveled. And in the sacred space of the temple, it might pass through veils unseen in waking life. Sleep was not passive, it was pilgrimage. The temple itself was part of this journey. Walls were inscribed with protective spells, ceilings painted with stars. Some chambers had curved designs meant to evoke the womb, a symbolic space of rebirth and transformation. Sleep here wasn't just about healing. It was about becoming something new. Interestingly, sleep temples weren't only for the sick. Some were used by priests and rulers seeking guidance before major decisions. Pharaohs, facing war or famine, would retreat into isolation, fast for a day or two, then lie down in a sleep chamber, hoping the gods would speak. These weren't dreams as entertainment. They were strategy sessions between man and divinity. There's even evidence that the famous Queen Hatshepsut consulted a sleep oracle before declaring herself pharaoh. Temple records from Deir el-Bahari suggest she dreamed of the god Amun, who told her, "You are my daughter. You shall rule Egypt." Whether this dream was genuine or politically convenient is up for debate, but the symbolism held power either way. But sleep temples weren't immune to skepticism. In later periods, especially during Greek and Roman occupation, some visitors mocked the practice. They saw it as superstition. But the Greeks themselves would come to adopt and adapt the idea, most famously in the Asclepians, healing temples dedicated to Asclepius, where patients also slept and dreamed of cures. In fact, it was the fusion of Egyptian and Greek dream, traditions that carried sleep temples into the wider Mediterranean world. But here's the quiet truth. For over 1,000 years, Egyptians believed, with complete sincerity, that the space between wakefulness and sleep was sacred, that the answers to suffering might come not from waking effort, but from surrendering to rest in the right place, with the right intention. And as you picture one of those dark stone chambers, lit by a single lamp, smelling of lotus and frankincense, filled with the steady breath of a hopeful sleeper, you might ask yourself, when did we stop believing that sleep could be a kind of prayer? Where dreams were diagnoses, as you step further into the hush of an ancient Egyptian sleep temple, the atmosphere changes. These were not places of spectacle or loud ritual. They were places of stillness, the kind of stillness where even the air felt thick with waiting. Once a patient had been purified and ushered into the sleep chamber, the temple's work didn't stop. Priests and scribes remained nearby, not watching, but attuned. They believed that the room itself could influence the dream, and so they maintained a controlled environment, steady incense, quiet chanting, filtered moonlight. The Egyptians didn't just believe sleep was healing, they believed what you dreamed could reveal what was wrong with you. We often talk today about the mystery of dreams, but for them, dreams were practical, if symbolic. Much like physicians today use scans and lab reports, Egyptian dream priests used imagery as data. The appearance of animals, colors, rivers, stars, all carried meaning. In one recovered dream book from the 13th dynasty, now housed in the British Museum, hundreds of dream scenarios are listed alongside their interpretations. Here are just a few examples. If a man dreams of eating crocodile flesh, it means he will defeat his enemy. If one dreams of drowning, it foretells rebirth, or the cleansing of illness. If a snake speaks to the dreamer, the disease shall be long but not fatal. These interpretations weren't arbitrary. They drew on mythology, medicine, and personal symbolism. The crocodile, for instance, was both a feared predator and a form of the god Sobek, associated with strength and healing. Water symbolized the Nile, lifeblood and danger all in one. The priests acted as both translators and guides. They didn't just interpret, they created prescriptions based on dreams. If a dream revealed heat in the body, cooling herbs might be recommended. If a dream showed shadowy figures, a purification ritual could follow. Sometimes, the cure was not physical at all, but a vow to make peace with someone or offer restitution. Some temples even recorded the names of those cured by dreams. These inscriptions often read like testimonials. In the third season of flood, I came to the temple with aching limbs. I lay beneath the gaze of the god. In dream, I saw a scorpion leave my chest and vanish into dust. Upon waking, I no longer trembled. It's tempting to read these as myth, but to the Egyptians, they were history, not stories, evidence. What's remarkable is how patient-focused this system was. The temples didn't treat symptoms. They treated the person, their fears, their hopes, their spiritual condition. The process of dreaming was a form of self-revelation, encouraged and amplified by the sacred space. This personal journey, of course, was deeply tied to the Egyptian understanding of the soul. The soul, to them, had multiple parts. Two of the most relevant here were the ka, your life force, your vitality, inherited at birth; the bay, your personality or soul, the part that traveled during dreams and after death. During sleep, it was believed the bay temporarily left the body. This is why sleep was considered a vulnerable state. Without proper protection, a wandering soul might return changed, or not return at all. To guard against this, temples used dream amulets, small objects placed beside the sleeper, often carved, with symbols of the eye of Horus, scarabs, or ankhs. Some amulets were shaped like miniature beds, meant to coax the Bae back safely. The temple also employed trained chant leaders, whose job was to whisper protective phrases as patients fell asleep, a melodic verbal thread guiding the soul gently into the dream world. And here's a fascinating detail. Not all dreamers saw gods. Some reported seeing deceased family members, ancestors, sometimes strangers. In one preserved account, a woman described dreaming of a donkey speaking to her in her mother's voice. The priest interpreted this not as madness, but as a message of reconciliation from beyond. To the modern mind, it may all seem superstitious. The incense, the symbols, the dreams. But if you strip away the cultural layers, what remains is a deeply humane idea that healing begins in quiet. That answers come not through force, but through surrender. And that the soul, when listened to, may know what the body has forgotten. It wasn't just about sleep. It was about permission to rest, fully, deliberately, spiritually. You may wonder what it felt like to lie down in such a place, to be wrapped in clean linen, to hear the hum of ancient voices, to be surrounded by stone, by sacred air, to feel, as you drifted into sleep, that something or someone was listening. And perhaps the greatest question of all is this: did people really dream of the gods? Or did they dream what they needed and call it divine? Fading rituals and the silence of the gods. As centuries passed and the golden age of pharaonic Egypt gave way to shifting empires and foreign rulers, the once sacred sleep temples began to fall into disuse. Some were abandoned, others were repurposed into chapels, grain storage, or simple ruins that disappeared beneath layers of sand and silence. The prayers grew quieter, the dream scrolls crumbled, the sacred beds lay cold. But for nearly 2,000 years, the Egyptians believed that rest could be sacred, that sleep was a meeting point between body and spirit, between human and divine, between today and whatever lay beyond. Why did this belief vanish? It wasn't one reason, it was many. First came the Greeks and the Ptolemies, who admired Egyptian ritual but filtered it through Hellenistic philosophy. They brought their own gods, their own healing methods, and eventually built their own sleep temples, most famously the Asclepians, where incubation continued but with a more clinical approach. Then came the Romans, who turned the practice further toward formal medicine. While some temples remained in use, especially in rural regions of Upper Egypt, the focus shifted away from sacred dreams and toward bodily diagnosis. The idea of sleep as divine communication gradually faded. Finally, the spread of Christianity marked a profound cultural shift. The early church discouraged many pagan rituals, including dream interpretation, which was often viewed with suspicion or branded as heresy. The dream temples, so closely tied to Egypt's older religious system, were no longer tolerated. By the 4th century CE, most had closed, but the practice didn't disappear completely. It transformed. In monastic communities across the Mediterranean, dreams were still discussed, just in hushed tones. Saints reported visions during sleep. Hermits recorded symbolic dreams in journals. And though the dream temples were gone, their spirit lingered in the idea that stillness could be healing. That night was not just for recovery, but for revelation. Even today, in some Coptic Christian communities in Egypt, stories persist of sacred dreams. People still light candles for those seeking answers in their sleep. Some even say the old temples, buried and nameless, still hum beneath the ground, holding centuries of whispered prayers. And in the West, centuries later, as psychoanalysis emerged in the 19th century, thinkers like Freud and Jung began re-elevating the dream. Not as divine communication, but as a map of the subconscious. Still sacred in a way, just turned inward. It's strange, isn't it? How much we've forgotten about how seriously sleep was once taken. Today, we often treat rest as an inconvenience, something to squeeze between obligations. We seek sleep hacks, blue light filters, productivity boosts. But the ancient Egyptians saw it differently. They saw sleep as sacrifice, time offered to the unknown in exchange for healing, insight, or peace. You didn't simply fall asleep. You entered sleep. You prepared for it, trusted it, waited for its wisdom. And perhaps there's something we can learn from them, not by building temples, but by rethinking what sleep might be. A portal, a mirror, a gentle God. Imagine tonight, before bed, you turned off the screens, lit a small candle, breathed deeply, and said, not aloud but with intention, I am listening. What might you hear? What might you dream? The ancient priests would tell you. The gods still speak, but only in silence. And if they no longer speak, perhaps the dreams still do. Because in the end, the dream temples may have crumbled, but the question they asked, whispered in stone corridors beneath moonlight, still remains. What if the cure has always been waiting, in sleep? Sleeping upright in the French court, the odd habits of Louis XIV. The king who slept sitting up, at the glittering height of the 17th century, few places on earth were more extravagant or more choreographed than the Palace of Versailles. It was not simply a royal residence, it was a stage, and at the very center of that stage stood Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis reigned for over 72 years, longer than any monarch in European history. His court was a theatre of etiquette, power, and surveillance, where every glance had political meaning. Every yawn could be scandalous, and even sleep was a performance. So it might not surprise you to learn that the king, who controlled armies, nobles, and culture, also had peculiar sleep habits. The most famous of these, he often slept sitting up. To understand why, we must step inside the king's bedchamber, a room not of peace, but of ritual. The Chambre du Roi at Versailles wasn't tucked away in a private wing. It sat near the geographic center of the palace, symbolizing the king as the sun around which all things revolved. Each day, hundreds of people passed through this room, noblemen, ambassadors, attendants, to witness the royal lever and coucher, the public ceremonies of waking and going to bed. Yes, that's right. Going to bed was a formal, public event. Each evening, shortly after 10 p.m., the king would perform his coucher. This wasn't private relaxation. It was a deeply structured ritual in which courtiers observed the king change into nightclothes, offer brief conversation, and be tucked into bed. But the evening did not end there. The moment the curtains were drawn and the last noble bowed his way out of the room, the king would often rise again, or more accurately, adjust himself to sleep upright. Why? There were several reasons. Some practical, some cultural, and some deeply personal. First, there was the issue of health. At the time, it was widely believed, especially among physicians and apothecaries, that lying completely flat was dangerous for digestion. The 17th century French medical establishment warned that reclined sleep could disturb the humours, allow vapours to rise to the head, and contribute to apoplexy, a feared cause of sudden death. This belief wasn't limited to royalty. Many noblemen and women of the court slept partially upright, propped with multiple pillows or custom-angled beds. But Louis XIV took this further. His bed was designed with an adjustable incline, allowing him to remain semi-seated, his upper body elevated throughout the night. Second, there were rumors of vulnerability. Louis was a man obsessed with control. He had lived through a noble uprising, the Fronde, during his childhood, and never forgot the feeling of danger in his own home. Sleeping upright made him feel alert, less exposed. Some accounts suggest that guards and attendants remained in or near his chamber all night, ready to respond should the king stir or call out. Then there was the matter of his legs. In later years, Louis XIV suffered from numerous ailments: gout, abscesses, and ulcers, especially in the lower limbs. Sleeping flat increased swelling and pain. Physicians encouraged him to elevate his upper body, and in some cases, even his feet. His bed became a carefully managed environment, not for softness or comfort, but for strategic positioning. This was not uncommon in his time. Aristocrats, fearing all sorts of maladies from blood congestion to melancholy, often adopted strange sleep postures. There are records of nobles using special sleep chairs that allowed them to rest upright for hours. These chairs were padded, tilted slightly back, and came with elbow rests, a kind of early recliner for the elite. Still, Louis XIV went further. His attendants noted that the king would sleep with one arm raised slightly, supported by cushions, to help circulation. His nightshirt was loose but finely tailored. His bedclothes were made of the softest linen, scented lightly with herbs, often lavender, believed to ward off fever and nightmares. And always someone was watching. A valet, a chamberlain, or a guard was stationed within earshot at all times. Sleep for the Sun King was not escape. It was simply a quiet performance, a space between acts, not the end of the show. What's curious is how public this private function remained. The royal bedchamber was never his alone. Even after his causa ceremony, it was not unusual for late-night political discussions to occur, while the king sat half-reclined in bed. Some historians describe ambassadors being ushered in for urgent conversations, where Louis remained seated in a semi-upright pose, wearing a velvet robe, one foot exposed, regal even in rest. There's something deeply lonely about this. Imagine sleeping in a room filled with gold leaf and mirrors, your body propped up like a figure on display, servants at attention, decisions pending even in the dark. Louis XIV, for all his power, rarely had a moment of unobserved stillness. Even his dreams, one suspects, carried echoes of the day's pageantry. What kind of rest can one truly have, sleeping like a statue? And yet, this odd, upright posture became not just habit, it became doctrine. Medical texts of the 18th century began recommending semi-reclined sleep for those of high status. To sleep lying flat was seen as rustic, peasant-like. Refined bodies, it was thought, required elevation, above the earth, above illness, and perhaps, symbolically, above the common folk. As we close this section, we're left with a man who ruled empires by day, but could never fully lie down at night. And that leads us to a quiet question. If sleep requires surrender, what happens to a man who was never allowed to let go? Bedtime as power, too. Most of us today, the bedroom is a place of privacy, quiet, and retreat. But in the court of Louis XIV, sleep was anything but private, and bedtime was an exercise in statecraft. Louis understood something many rulers before, and after him never quite mastered. Ritual equals control, and so he turned his daily routines, including his sleep, into tightly choreographed ceremonies. The causa, or bedtime ritual, was not just for show. It reinforced the entire hierarchy of Versailles. Dozens of courtiers gathered nightly, ranked by proximity and privilege, to witness the king's transition from the ruler of France to the occupant of a bed that symbolized both comfort and absolute authority. Each nobleman had a prescribed role. One held the candle, another passed the king's nightshirt. A select few were honored with the task of drawing the bed curtains. These gestures weren't menial. They were political rewards, a nod from the Sun King that your presence mattered, that you were close to the royal body, and therefore to royal favor. And after the ceremony ended, the king didn't actually sleep immediately. As we learned, he often rose again, in partial secrecy, adjusting pillows, easing his legs, sometimes engaging in private counsel with trusted aides or physicians. This late-night adjustment, both literal and metaphorical, reveals a strange truth about his reign. Louis XIV never truly rested. Every movement, even sleep, had to be orchestrated for maximum symbolism. There's a peculiar document in the archives of Versailles, a Chamberlain's nightly report, which logs, among other things, the precise angle of the king's upper body during sleep. 30 degrees above horizontal, one note says. Pillows refreshed at the second hour. Another entry describes how the king's left leg was elevated slightly to reduce swelling. To modern ears, it sounds more medical than majestic, but within the Baroque pageantry of the French court, even such adjustments had theatrical weight. Why did this matter? Because in Louis's vision of monarchy, his body was France. To sleep was not to withdraw from duty, it was to model order. If the king slept calmly and properly, elevated, upright, still, then the kingdom, too, was stable. If the king stirred or required attention in the night, it wasn't just a health matter. It could become a political tremor. This wasn't just metaphor. There are accounts of foreign envoys reporting on the quality of the king's sleep back to their home governments. A bad night might signal illness, weakness, or vulnerability. One Spanish ambassador once noted, "The king did not rest well last night. It is said the right leg was inflamed. His manner at lever was subdued. We advise caution in trade negotiations this week." So yes, even Louis's bedtime posture had geopolitical consequences. And the upright position, it conveyed alertness. Even in dreams, the Sun King must appear ready, vigilant, above. It's easy to forget how important posture once was. In 17th century Europe, posture conveyed virtue. To stand upright was to be moral, disciplined. To sit slouched or recline without purpose was seen as lazy, even decadent. Louis's vertical sleep aligned him, quite literally, with ideals of control, elegance, and divine favor. His physicians reinforced this. They claimed that sleeping upright aided circulation, prevented nighttime congestion, and reduced the risk of nocturnal suffocation, a mysterious diagnosis we might now associate with sleep apnea. Reclining sleep was considered dangerous, especially for the elderly or the noble. Yet beneath all these rationalizations, one suspects something more vulnerable. Louis was surrounded by mirrors, but rarely solitude. Even in bed, he was never alone. The upright position may have felt less like a choice and more like a posture of defense, against his body, against his court, and perhaps against the creeping shadow of mortality. There's a haunting letter, written by one of his night attendants shortly before the king's final illness. In it, he describes the king dozing in his upright bed, candlelight flickering on his face, murmuring lines of Latin prayer. The room was quiet, the curtains drawn. The king sat still, as always, upright, composed, crownless but no less royal, and yet, the attendant wrote, he did not seem asleep. He seemed waiting, as though expecting someone he would not name. It's a subtle image. The most powerful man in Europe, not resting but watching, even in sleep. And it leaves us wondering, what toll does it take on the soul to turn rest into performance? And can a man ever dream freely if he never lies down fully? The bed as a throne. By the final decades of his life, Louis XIV had transformed the act of sleeping into something few rulers before him had dared, a continuation of sovereignty. He was no longer merely a king in waking hours. He was a monarch, even in slumber. And the royal bed? It had become his second throne. The design of his bedchamber reflected this. The bed stood upon a raised platform, enclosed by a gilded balustrade. Only the most privileged nobles were allowed to approach it. Behind layers of velvet curtains and sculpted sunbursts lay the bed itself, wide, firm, and layered with cushions arranged not for comfort, but for positioning. Louis rarely, if ever, lay flat. Even in deep illness, attendance carefully preserved. His sleeping posture, semi-upright, arm cushioned, legs angled slightly, robes arranged neatly across his chest. There are reports from the court physician, Guy Crescent Fagan, detailing how the king's breathing was monitored throughout the night, and how herbal sachets were placed near the pillows to calm his humours. But this elaborate posture wasn't solely for health. By then, it had become doctrine. The image of Louis XIV, upright, composed, and eternally alert, was essential to maintaining Versailles' delicate hierarchy. In a palace where sleep was political, even how one pretended to sleep mattered. The king's chamber remained accessible during certain parts of the night. His snoring was documented. His murmurs were noted. The bed was a performance space, and the performance was endless. Even after death began to approach, Louis clung to the ritual. In 1715, just days before his passing, he still participated in a modified cowshire. Though visibly frail and in pain, he allowed the ceremony to continue, nobles attending as they always had, observing the tucking of sheets, the dimming of candles, the bows and exits. He did not break character, and when he died, aged 76, in that very bed, France entered mourning not just for a king, but for a way of being. His upright posture, his choreographed sleep, his ceremonial bed, all of it had defined not just his nights, but the rhythm of the entire court. When Louis XIV finally lay flat in death, it was the first time many of his attendants had ever seen him in such a position. The symbolism was profound. The Sun King had set. What remained afterward was the echo of his rituals. Successors tried to maintain them, but none with the same gravity. Louis XV and Louis XV abandoned parts of the coucher, preferring more private routines. Sleep slowly returned to the realm of privacy, of softness, of humanity. But the legacy lingered. The royal bed, once a place of statecraft, remained a potent symbol. Furniture makers across France began producing upright sleeping chairs, modelled after the king's posture. Aristocrats commissioned beds of visibility, meant not for hiding, but for display. Even among commoners, the idea took root. To sleep upright was to aspire toward refinement. Ironically, in the centuries that followed, modern science would largely reject the practice. Sleep studies now associate upright sleeping with poor circulation, shallow REM cycles, and neck strain. We are told to lie flat, to let go, to surrender. But perhaps the Sun King couldn't. For Louis, sleep was never about letting go. It was about maintaining form, maintaining rule, maintaining the illusion of control, even in the most vulnerable state of all, unconsciousness. So what can we learn from his strange ritual? Not that we should sleep upright, but that how we sleep reflects who we think we are. Louis believed himself to be the center of a cosmic order. Even in sleep, he couldn't drift. He had to shine. And maybe that's the quiet tragedy. Because while we often think of sleep as freedom, as rest, for Louis XIV, it was just another crown. Heavy, demanding, bright, even in the dark. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, unobserved, unguarded, allowed to sprawl freely, consider how lucky it is to sleep without performance, to stretch, to sigh, to disappear into dreams without witnesses, and ask yourself, is there any power greater than the ability to truly let go? Why 17th century sailors believed hammocks prevent nightmares. Rocked by the sea, not by sleep. The ocean, especially before the age of engines and satellites, was a place of terrifying uncertainty. Sailors faced storms, starvation, disease, and, mutiny. Yet amid the chaos of wind and wave, there emerged one simple invention that transformed how men slept at sea: the hammock, a length of sturdy canvas, slung between two beams, suspended like a cradle in the belly of a wooden ship. Today, we think of hammocks as leisurely, a symbol of vacation, stillness, and breeze. But for 17th century sailors, hammocks were more than a bed. They were a lifeline, a shield, and perhaps most curiously, a charm against nightmares. Before the adoption of hammocks, sailors slept wherever they could, on planks, in corners, atop barrels. If lucky, they had a mat or blanket. These sleeping conditions were brutal. The ship's motion threw men across the floor during storms. Rats scurried past their faces. The groaning of timbers and the slap of waves turned sleep into a battle. And then came the hammock. Historians generally trace its introduction to Caribbean indigenous peoples, especially the Taino, who used woven nets suspended between trees. Spanish and Portuguese explorers took notice. The design spread rapidly through European navies by the 16th and 17th centuries, evolving into the canvas or rope hammocks we recognize today. At first, the motivation was practical. Hammocks allowed sailors to sleep above the filthy, wet decks. Suspended from the beams, they swayed with the ship rather than against it. This reduced injury during turbulent weather. No more rolling across the floor like barrels of rum. And they were portable. At dawn, hammocks could be rolled up, clearing space on the tightly packed lower decks. But something stranger happened too. Sailors began to claim that sleeping in hammocks reduced their nightmares. To understand why, we have to consider how people at sea understood sleep, and the fear it carried. The ship was not only a workplace, it was a floating world, isolated, unstable, shaped by superstition. For centuries, sailors believed the sea was inhabited by spirits, both protective and malicious. Nightmares were not dismissed as psychological disturbances, but as visitations. A nightmare might be seen as a sea witch riding your chest, or a drowned soul pulling you into sleep. The hammocks, somehow, disrupted this. In the lower decks, where hammocks hung in rows like white cocoons, sailors reported fewer dreams of drowning, less sleep paralysis, and more restful nights. Even as the ship pitched in storms above, they began to associate the gentle rocking motion of the hammock with safety. It wasn't just a bed, it was a barrier, a floating cradle that kept you above the malevolent forces below. Some crews developed small rituals. They would knot their hammock ropes in specific ways to bind the dream. Others rubbed garlic along the fabric, a recurring motif, as we've seen. A few even tied small charms, teeth, coins, or tiny crucifixes, near the ends of the hammock, believing they warded off spirits while the sailor slept. And here's the interesting part. Many of these men, toughened by war and salt, believed in these habits completely. Why? Because sleep at sea was frightening. Not just because of motion or noise, but because of vulnerability. A man asleep in a hostile sea, far from land, far from help, was easy prey for anything unseen. The hammock gave structure to that chaos. In a rare diary entry from an English merchant sailor in 1672, we read, "Since I've taken to the sling-bed hammock, I no longer wake with screams. I feel the ship in my bones, but not in my dreams. It is as if I hang between waking and death, but fear neither." That phrase, between waking and death, captures the peculiar space sailors lived in. They floated on water, they floated in dreams, and in the hammock, they floated even in sleep. Unanchored, but safe. Of course, not all nightmares vanished. Stories still circulated about sailors who screamed in the night, who dreamed of being swallowed by whales or pulled into the black by ghost hands. But the consensus passed from ship to ship was clear. The hammock was protection. It wasn't a superstition in the formal sense, not like a lucky coin or a ban on whistling into the wind. It was subtler. A belief that the rhythm of the sea, when matched by the rhythm of the sleeper's cradle, created peace. And perhaps, more than protection from spirits, the hammock offered something else. A return to infancy. Cradled, rocked, suspended. When you've spent your waking hours shouting orders, scrubbing decks, and watching shipmates die of scurvy, there's something quietly radical about letting yourself be held, even by a swaying length of canvas. And so the hammock became more than a bed. It became a gentle companion, a whispering rope that said, "You are safe. For now. Sleep." Still, one question lingered among older sailors, passed in low voices beneath creaking beams. If the hammock guards the body, what guards the soul when it floats out to sea? Between the wood and the water, by the late 1600s, hammocks had become not only common, but essential aboard European ships. From Spanish galleons to Dutch merchant vessels, from English naval frigates to pirate sloops in the Caribbean, these swaying, canvas cocoons lined the lower decks like rows of suspended shells. At night, when the ship's bell marked the change of watch and the sky darkened above the sails, men would climb into their hammocks and disappear, not entirely asleep, but suspended, gently rocked, breathing in rhythm with the sea. But as useful as the hammock was for physical rest, its psychological role may have been even more profound. Because at sea, the line between wakefulness and dreaming was thin. Time blurred aboard a ship. Days were divided not by sun and moon, but by bells and watches, every 4 hours, around the clock. There was no normal sleep schedule. A sailor might catch 2 hours here, 3 hours there. Full nights of sleep were rare. The constant creak of the timbers, the slap of rope, the murmur of water against hull, all of it formed a kind of soundscape that never ended. And yet, within this noise, the hammock offered a strange silence. Unlike a bunk or mattress, the hammock absorbed motion. It cushioned, it cocooned, it didn't groan with the ship, it moved with it. That movement, that gentle sway, became something many sailors described with words that might surprise you. Peace. One French privateer, writing in 1703, recalled, "We fight by day, we drink by dusk, but at night my hammock sways, as if God himself were cradling me. It is the only place I do not remember the war." In this way, the hammock became a refuge, not just from physical danger, but from mental fatigue, loneliness, and the ever-present fear that tomorrow might bring cannon fire, drowning, or disease. Even seasoned captains, hardened by decades at sea, developed rituals around their hammocks. Some slept fully clothed, boots dangling over the side. Others stripped to linen shirts and used rope belts to keep from rolling too far in a storm. Many chose to sleep with a hand loosely gripping a hanging rope or personal token, a charm, a ring, a carved bead, and still the stories of hammock dreams persisted. In British naval folklore, it was said that dying in your hammock meant your spirit would never leave the ship, that you'd remain, swaying above the floorboards, caught forever between worlds. This was seen not as a threat, but as a kind of loyalty. A sailor who died in his hammock died at peace. On some ships, there were tales of hammocks remembering previous owners. Men reported strange dreams when assigned a hammock that had once belonged to a lost crewman. They claimed to hear voices, feel phantom sways, or wake with unfamiliar emotions, joy, sorrow, fear, that seemed not their own. Was this superstition? Maybe. Or maybe it was grief, expressed in the only language sailors could trust, dreams. Because few places were more haunted, literally and emotionally, than the sea. Men died quickly and were buried swiftly. Hammocks doubled as shrouds. When a sailor died, his hammock was tied around his body, weighted, and slid into the ocean. A final cradle lowered back into the mother sea. This ritual, quiet, brutal, and routine, etched itself into the minds of those who remained. And so, sleeping in a hammock meant more than rest. It meant returning each night to the edge of death and waking again by grace or luck. No wonder they clung to rituals. No wonder they whispered charms. No wonder some sailors would gently rock themselves before sleep, as if reminding the sea, not tonight, not yet. Naval logs and sailors' journals occasionally mention hammock companions. Not other men, but dream figures who appeared regularly. A woman with kelp for hair, a shadow man with a compass in his chest, a cat with 6 eyes. These recurring dreams became legends among crews, passed between ships. One officer wrote, "I sleep best when the ship rocks and the sea woman hums. She comes only in the hammock. Never on land. I do not fear her. I think she keeps the other things away." What did it mean? A hallucination from lack of sleep? A metaphor for longing, or a ghost of past trauma? Or was it, as sailors believed, a guardian of dreams, visible only from a canvas sling above the salt-worn boards? We may never know, but what we do know is that over time, the act of sleeping in a hammock became a kind of identity. To be a sailor was to sleep suspended, to live between sky and sea, and to dream in rhythm with tides and timbers. And as hammocks spread from ships to land, to tropical plantations, to explorer camps, even to aristocratic gardens, their original meaning faded. But among the old hands of the sea, the belief remained. Sleep soft, swing slow, and the sea will leave your soul alone. Still, one last mystery lingered. Sailors sometimes spoke of dreams where the hammock was missing, where they fell endlessly through space, unable to stop. These dreams always ended in the same way, with a splash and a voice and the cold, and so they would check their ropes, retie the knots, whisper a word or two, then lie down again and hope. If I must dream, let it be from the cradle, not the deep, the cradle and the grave. By the dawn of the 18th century, hammocks had become more than bedding aboard ships. They were a standard of the sea, a solution that was both strangely elegant and deeply psychological. Navies across Europe began to issue them as part of standard equipment. Records from the Royal Navy list one hammock with clues and lines, alongside rations of hardtack and salted meat. Naval regulations outlined exactly how hammocks should be hung, aired, and stowed. Officers inspected their condition. Sailors embroidered initials on them, wove knots into the bindings, turned them into a kind of personal space in a place with no privacy. But it was what happened at the end of a sailor's life that sealed the hammock's deeper meaning. When death came, whether from disease, battle, or accident, the dead were not placed in coffins. They were wrapped in their hammocks. 2 round-shot, iron cannonballs were sewn at the feet to ensure a proper sinking. The final stitch, always through the nose or lip, ensured the man was truly dead. It was both brutal and practical. Then the body, swaddled and swaying, was lifted by the crew. Words were spoken, and the hammock was returned to the sea. The same canvas that had rocked the sailor to sleep night after night now delivered him to the deep. In this way, the hammock became a symbol not only of rest, but of release. Some sailors, knowing this, fate became attached to their hammocks, the way others held rosary beads or family portraits. They patched them, slept in the same one for decades. A weathered, salt-stiff hammock was not seen as uncomfortable. It was earned. It knew their weight, their shape, their story. And the sea, they believed, recognized that story too. There's a quiet poetry in this, in being cradled in life and laid to rest in the same fabric, in trusting a strip of canvas to hold you, not just through storms, but through sorrow, pain, longing, and memory. Some crews, when particularly close to a fallen mate, would not reuse the hammock, even if still serviceable. They would leave it empty for a few nights, letting it sway beside them. A gesture not of superstition, but of respect. Because to sailors, the hammock wasn't just a tool, it was a witness. It had absorbed their sweat, their breath, their fears. It had heard whispered prayers and silent sobs, and it had held them aloft in a world that offered little else to hold on to. Eventually, with the rise of steam power and larger ships, hammocks gave way to bunks. Crews became larger, sleeping quarters more rigid. The old naval traditions faded. Hammocks were dismissed as outdated, inefficient. But those who had slept in them remembered. Some retired sailors refused to sleep in beds ever again. They strung hammocks in their cottages, in barns, between trees. Even decades after their last voyage, they found it difficult to sleep on solid ground. The stillness, they said, was too loud, and when asked why, they answered, "The hammock moves like memory. The bed forgets." Today, hammocks are seen in backyards, on beaches, in travel ads, pleasant, peaceful, quiet. But their history is made of storms, of wooden hulls and creaking ropes, of young men curled in canvas, dreaming of home, or death, or land that didn't shift beneath their feet. They were poor in comfort, rich in symbolism, and within their gentle sway was an ancient wisdom, that the body, like the sea, must be rocked into stillness, not forced, and as you lie in your own bed tonight, perhaps still, perhaps not, consider the simplicity of that idea. That motion can soothe. That fabric can protect. That sleep can come not in silence, but in rhythm. And ask yourself, if we each carry storms inside us, where is the hammock that holds us above the waves? Moss beds and bone blankets. How Viking warriors recovered overnight. Sleep in the frozen silence. The Viking world was not built for comfort. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, Norse warriors carved out lives along the jagged coasts of Scandinavia, cold, windswept lands where darkness lasted for months, and summers arrived like a whisper. They rowed longships across oceans, fought on foreign shores, and returned to icy homesteads carved into the hills. And at night, after the shouting and rowing, after the clinking of weapons and the warmth of mead, they slept. But Viking sleep wasn't soft. It was calculated, pragmatic, and tied deeply to the elements. They slept on moss. They covered themselves in fur and bone, and their rituals of rest, rarely spoken but strictly followed, helped turn exhausted men into warriors again by dawn. We don't have Viking bedtime journals. What we do have are sagas, burial sites, household remains, and careful archaeological records, all of which paint a surprisingly vivid picture of how and why these people slept the way they did. The bed beneath the bones. The typical Viking longhouse was a long, smoke-filled structure made of timber, earth, and turf. At its heart was the fire pit, always burning, always watched. Around it, sleeping platforms were built into the walls, usually raised off the floor to stay dry during freezing seasons. The bedding was basic. They used dried moss, layered, with sheep wool and sometimes hay if moss was scarce. The moss served multiple purposes. It was insulating, absorbent, and slightly antimicrobial, perfect for nights that stretched 16 hours in winter and where bathing was rare. Moss was also easy to gather and replace, making it ideal for rough environments. But what covered them was even more interesting. Furs, of course. Bear, reindeer, wolf were the most common top layer. But in some households, archaeologists have found blankets lined with carved bones, typically from elk or deer. These weren't weapons or tools. They were weights stitched into the edges of furs to hold them close to the body, even during restless or freezing nights. Think of them as ancient weighted blankets, designed to calm, protect, and prevent exposure to deadly cold. Some have speculated that these bone blankets also served a spiritual purpose. In Norse mythology, bones held power. They were seen as anchors for the spirit, the last part of the body to decay, the seat of identity. Sleeping under bone may have been more than warmth. It may have been a shield from wandering spirits, from night stalkers, from the Draugr. Undead figures believed to haunt those who died without honor. The weight of bone, the scratch of moss, the crackle of fire nearby, this was Viking rest. A warrior's nap sleep wasn't always long or luxurious. Raids, especially in the summer, demanded irregular hours. Viking warriors often napped in shifts, resting aboard ships, under trees, or on rocky shores. Here, too, moss appeared. Warriors carried pouches of dried moss, sometimes soaked in warm water and used as makeshift pillows or joint wraps. The scent, earthy, soft, familiar, offered a moment of peace between violence. One passage from an Icelandic saga describes a group of warriors, bloodied from battle, returning to a hall and sleeping without words. They said nothing. They laid down their weapons. They wrapped themselves in fur. The sound of breathing grew thick as snow. Outside, the world watched. Inside, no one moved. The silence of Viking sleep was often total. No singing, no storytelling, just breath and darkness. In part, this was survival. Longhouses had no chimneys. Smoke lingered. Too much movement stirred soot or let in cold. So people lay still, close. Together, bodies lined like firewood, preserving heat. Children slept beside parents. Warriors beside brothers in arms. Servants, dogs, even livestock were sometimes nearby, separated only by wooden slats. The rhythm of sleep was communal. Your body didn't rest alone. It rested as part of a whole. And in a culture where death was a frequent visitor, that closeness mattered. One funeral site in Norway revealed a man buried with his sleeping fur, still matted, still stitched, with reindeer hide. The fur wasn't ceremonial, it was used, worn through. It had held him many nights, and in death, it held him again. So what did Vikings dream of? We don't know. But the sagas speak often of dream visions, of ravens calling, in sleep, of long ships sailing through clouds, of gods whispering names in darkness. These weren't seen as oddities. They were considered messages, often tied to fate, which the Norse believed was already written by the Norns, the weavers of destiny. You didn't change fate, but if you listened closely in sleep, you might hear its footsteps. As we end this first section, picture the moment. A room lit only by embers. Men and women wrapped in moss and fur, weighted by bone. Silent, except for breath. The wind howls outside. The gods walk unseen. And in that thick, frozen quiet, sleep arrives not as luxury, but as armor. Still, one question lingers. When the night is long and the gods are watching, is rest an offering or a test? Dreams beneath the bearskins. In the world of the Vikings, sleep was never just about fatigue. It was about recovery, readiness, and above all, reverence. To body, to spirit, and to fate. While modern culture prizes REM cycles and sleep trackers, Viking rest focused on something more primal, endurance. After rowing 50 miles in brutal weather, after swinging an axe through bone and shield, a Viking didn't seek peace. He sought repair. And repair came through rituals most wouldn't notice, and some would never speak of aloud. The architecture. Of rest by the 10th century, most Viking longhouses were built with a central hearth and built-in sleeping alcoves, narrow wooden compartments tucked into walls. Think of them as horizontal closets, low-ceilinged, private, and just large enough for one or two bodies to curl inside. These alcoves were lined with woven mats of straw or wool, layered with dried moss and soft animal pelts. The moss acted as a cushion, but also as insulation. In winter, heat didn't come from fire alone. It came from shared body warmth, trapped and concentrated within tight quarters. Blankets weren't like ours. The average cover was an amalgam of stitched hides, softened with use, often decorated with runes, bone toggles, or charms sewn into the inner lining. It wasn't uncommon for warriors to sleep wrapped in their own cloaks, which smelled of leather, smoke, and salt. These cloaks, sometimes wool, sometimes bear or wolfskin, were prized objects. They went from battlefield to bedding, sacred in their dual role. And then there were the bone blankets, not entire covers made of bone, but fur-lined quilts, weighted with small carved tokens, antler slivers, polished rib fragments, or etched shoulder bones. These gave the blanket weight, and weight, they believed, gave security. Why? because the Norse had a deep respect for what lay beneath the surface. Nightmares and the unquiet dead in Norse mythology. The soul did not simply drift peacefully after death. The Draga, restless spirits, were feared by all. These were not ghosts of guilt or sorrow. These were corpses who refused to sleep. They haunted burial mounds, roamed winter fields, and, most terrifyingly, invaded dreams. To the Vikings, nightmares weren't meaningless images. They were encounters, sometimes omens, sometimes attacks. That's why bones, carved with protection runes, were sewn into bedding. That's why iron keys or knife hilts were placed beneath moss pillows, not to defend the body, but to anchor the soul. Many believed the soul, or Huga, could wander during sleep. If it returned to find the body unguarded, spiritually or physically, it might not come back clean, or worse, not come back at all. So while we may associate dream catchers with other cultures, the Vikings had their own approach. Dream anchoring, stone beads, bits of iron, animal teeth, small tokens with symbolic heft, were kept close to the heart or head at night. And it worked, at least according to them. In sagas, warriors describe dreams that saved lives, of wolves howling before ambushes, of mountains cracking just before avalanches. These weren't fantasy. These were warnings from the unseen world, delivered during sleep, trusted during waking. One tale, told in the Heimskringla, describes a Jarl who awoke screaming after dreaming that his bed was afloat in blood. He cancelled a voyage. Days later, the ship he had meant to board was lost in a storm. Coincidence? Perhaps, but to the Vikings, it was fate, whispered in sleep. Sleep as survival in the harsh Scandinavian winters, where daylight might last only a few hours. Sleep became a seasonal strategy. People slept longer, not always because they were tired, but because sleep conserved energy. It slowed the metabolism. It gave the body time to survive. Norse calendars marked Yule, the darkest time of year, as a period of deep rest and spiritual attention. Fires were kept low. Speaking at night was discouraged. People moved slowly, quietly, as though not to disturb the boundary between the living and the dead. And it was believed that during these long nights, the gods listened more closely. Prayers whispered before bed were thought to carry better. Ancestors came nearer. Children were told to behave, or else the Nissa, mischievous spirits, would whisper into their dreams and tangle their hair with icy knots. Even animals were folded into sleep rituals. Dogs curled near beds to guard against spirits. Horses, if restless at night, were seen as omens, signaling that something had entered the homestead that didn't belong. So Viking sleep wasn't silent. It was alive with meaning, with symbols, with belief. As we drift toward the final act of this story, you might picture the scene. A darkened hall, breath fogging in the cold, a fire snapping low, dozens of bodies wrapped in fur, some still armored, others cradling iron charms. The wind outside speaks in low tones, but inside it is still. And in that stillness, in the pause between one harsh day and the next, sleep takes hold. Not gently, but firmly, like a warrior placing a hand on your shoulder and saying, "Rest, you'll need it." But the final question still waits. If even warriors feared their dreams, what did they know that we have forgotten? The rest that forged the rage. In the saga-driven world of the Vikings, rest was not weakness. It was preparation. To sleep well was not to retreat. It was to recover with purpose, to rise ready, sharpened not just in body, but in spirit. This belief ran so deep that sleep itself became part of the Viking identity, an act of warrior maintenance, both spiritual and strategic. And yet, the line between sleep and something else, something darker, was never entirely clear. The sleepless rage Viking berserkers, feared warriors who entered battle in a trance-like frenzy, were said to sleep differently from others, not restlessly, as you might expect, but almost unnaturally still. Their sleep was heavy, cold, and silent. They wrapped themselves not in furs, but in bare wool, or sometimes nothing at all. According to myth, they drew strength from isolation and suffering. They would sleep away from the hearth, in the dark corners of halls, sometimes even outside in the snow. To train the soul, sagas say, to stay in the body. When they did dream, it was often of fire, wolves, or blood. Dreams interpreted as invitations from the gods of battle, particularly Odin, who ruled both poetry and war, sleep and death. There were whispered beliefs that berserkers could cross into other realms during sleep, and that when they returned, they were not quite the same. Whether myth or metaphor, this suggests something deeper. The Vikings saw sleep not only as healing, but as transformation. To sleep deeply was to risk return, changed. Sleep and the afterlife, to the Norse, how you slept in life shaped how you traveled in death. Those who died without honor, in sickness or with fear, might not reach Valhalla or Folkvanga, the realms of the honored dead. Instead, they would drift endlessly between worlds, cold and lost. Some sagas describe these souls as forever asleep, eyes open, but minds wandering. So it mattered how you rested. Not just when or how long, but the way you faced the dark. Some warriors insisted on falling asleep facing the door, weapons within reach. Others placed carved runestones beside their beds, with inscriptions meant to protect the soul at rest. And some families buried their loved ones with pillows made of moss, just like the ones they used in life, so the transition would feel familiar. Even in death, they deserved a bed they recognized. In a quiet corner of a Swedish burial mound, archaeologists discovered a set of child's bones, wrapped in a thick fur lining and buried with a small pillow stuffed with dried heather and moss. Beside it, a polished bone carved with the rune El-Haz, a symbol of protection. Sleep, it seems, was considered sacred at every stage of life. The breath of the wolf in Norse poetry. Sleep is sometimes compared to a wolf, slow to come, quick to flee, always circling. One poem in the Poetic Edda reads, "Sleep comes like the breath of the wolf, not when called, not when tamed. It watches you first." This captures the Viking understanding perfectly. Sleep was not guaranteed. It was not gentle. It was something you had to earn, with strength, with ritual, with readiness. And if it came not to soothe, but to prepare. In that mindset, the moss bed was not a luxury. The bone-weighted blanket was not strange. These were tools of survival, not just through the long winter, but through the shadowed dreamscapes that accompanied it. So what does this mean for us? Today, we seek rest through perfect mattresses, sound machines, climate control. We chase sleep as a passive reward. But the Vikings remind us, sleep is not escape. It is engagement, with fatigue, with fear, with fate. They did not try to outsmart sleep. They met it head-on, with iron charms under pillows and bones sewn into blankets. They expected darkness, and entered it with readiness, not retreat. And when they rose, stiff, cold, but whole, they carried that strength forward. So tonight, as you pull a soft blanket around your shoulders and listen to the quiet around, you remember this. Somewhere in the past, a man wrapped in moss and fur, with blood on his hands and snow in his beard, lay down beneath a timber roof. He closed his eyes, knowing that the gods were watching, that the dead were near, and that only his breath, slow and steady, kept him warm against the dark, and he slept. Because to face the next day's battles, he knew a warrior must be willing to rest as fiercely as he fights. The Ottoman sleep cure. Rosewater, silence, and weighted quilts. A prescription for stillness in the heart of 16th century Constantinople. Beneath the call to prayer, between marble courtyards and velvet-draped chambers, sleep was not was a passive act. It was a remedy, a ritual, a state cultivated with intention. For the Ottomans, particularly the ruling class, sleep was seen not simply as restoration, but as a form of medicine. And like any good medicine, it had rules, components, and dosage. At the center of this approach were three essential tools: rosewater, silence, and weight. These ingredients formed what physicians and philosophers of the empire came to call the Ottoman sleep cure. Not an official doctrine, but a slow-growing tradition practiced across palaces, healing houses, and even private homes. Let's step into one of those homes, or better yet, into a room inside the Topkapi Palace, where a sultan once prepared for nightly rest, the setting of sleep. The room is cool, dimly lit by oil lamps. The air smells faintly of rose, not cloying, but soft. Incense coils slowly through carved wooden screens. A servant moves quietly, laying out a yorgan, a thick, quilted cover filled with cotton or wool, stitched tightly, folded in thirds. It's heavy, but not stifling. It presses gently against the body, as if asking it to stay still. The bed is not a towering structure. It is low, close to the floor, wide enough for comfort, narrow enough for warmth, and beside it, always, a bowl of rosewater. Why rosewater? In Ottoman medicine, a blend of Greek humoral theory, Persian healing traditions, and Islamic prophetic medicine, rosewater was revered. It was cooling, calming, spiritually pure. Physicians like Sherefeddin Sabuncuoglu, writing in the 15th century, recommended rosewater for anxiety, palpitations, and melancholy. A cloth soaked in chilled rosewater might be placed on the forehead, before bed, or a few drops added to the hands, or the entire room lightly misted, not for scent alone, but to soothe the soul through the senses. Because in Ottoman thought, the nervous system wasn't separate from the spirit. A troubled heart could keep the mind pacing. A restless spirit could make the limbs twitch. So rest wasn't just about tiredness, it was about alignment. And that brings us to the second element: silence. The architecture of quiet Ottoman homes, particularly among the wealthy, were built with acoustic mindfulness. Thick walls, layered textiles, and inner courtyards helped buffer noise. Bedrooms were often positioned away from street-facing walls, shielded by arches and drapes. In sleep spaces, footsteps were muted by carpets. Doors were padded. Windows were shuttered in multiple layers: glass, then wood, then cloth. Even the breeze was softened as it passed through latticed screens. Silence wasn't just preferred, it was curated. Many believed that harsh sound during sleep fractured the dream. And dreams, of course, mattered. The Ottomans inherited from earlier Islamic tradition the belief that dreams could carry meaning, divine insight, warnings, even healing instructions. Physicians kept dream notebooks. Patients were sometimes asked about their dreams after sleep, not just as curiosities, but as data. So the night had to be protected. Servants walked barefoot. Night guards spoke in hand signs. Musicians in the court were trained to stop playing well before the hour of rest. Even birds were covered in fabric cages to mute their dawn chatter. All of this was done not in fear of sleep, but in respect for it. Which brings us to the final element: weight. The healing quilt. The Ottoman yorgan wasn't a casual blanket. It was thick, hand-stitched, and intentionally heavy. It hugged the sleeper, gently pressing them into stillness. And unlike scratchy wool or stiff hides, these quilts were lined with soft cotton or silk, filled with batting that retained heat, but never smothered. Some yorgans were perfumed, not directly, but by storing them near scented woods, like sandalwood or cedar. Others were embroidered with verses from the Quran, or protective phrases in Ottoman Turkish. A quilt wasn't just bedding. It was medicine stitched into cloth. Today, we know that weighted blankets can reduce anxiety, slow the heart rate, and deepen sleep. The Ottomans knew it intuitively. They observed that sick patients slept better under heavy covers, that children stopped crying more quickly, that the elderly, plagued by tremors or night fears, calmed down when gently pressed by weight. So they used it and refined it and passed it down from palace to province, from sultan to servant. As this section ends, you might picture that quiet Ottoman chamber, a bowl of rosewater nearby, a heavy quilt laid gently, the hum of silence wrapping around, the sleeper like a second blanket. The night asks nothing. The body listens. The mind exhales. And still, one question floats like a scent in the dark. If silence and softness could heal the soul, why did we ever stop sleeping this way? Prescriptions for the restless mind. In the medical manuscripts of the Ottoman Empire, tucked between lists of herbs and treatments for gout or fever, you'll find a curious category: disorders of sleep. These weren't brushed aside as personal quirks. They were studied, debated, and treated with care. Physicians understood insomnia, nightmares, and sleepwalking, not as mental defects, but as imbalances, disruptions of the body's internal harmony. And the solutions often looked nothing like what we expect today. Because Ottoman medicine treated rest as a system, a process to be tended, not merely the absence of wakefulness, but a condition that could be strengthened or weakened, like digestion or vision. So how did they restore it? They turned to what they called the four soothing forces: scent, weight, stillness, sequence. We've already seen scent and weight, rosewater and heavy quilts. Let's look now at the other two. Stillness as medicine in Ottoman sleep. Theory. Stillness began before the body reached the bed. You didn't simply fall into sleep after a busy evening. You prepared for it, often for over an hour. This was especially true for the elderly, the sick, or those prone to what they called night stirring of the mind. The ritual began with a light meal, often broth, rice, or warm milk with crushed almonds. Heavy meals were avoided, as digestion was believed to heat the liver and delay sleep. Then came the walk, a slow, circular pace around the room or courtyard. No talking, no music, just movement to allow the body to lower its flame, as one physician wrote. Then, once the pulse slowed, the sleeper would sit, on a cushion, on the floor, at the edge of the bed, and do nothing. This pause, quiet and intentional, was described in one manuscript as the emptying of excess thought. No prayers, no readings, no reflection, just silence. Some took this moment to place their hand in rosewater. Others, especially the elderly, rubbed their chests with warm olive oil, which was said to calm the lungs and prevent night terrors. Then came the quilt, heavy but not smothering, pulled up slowly, almost ceremonially, and then, finally, the position. Sleeping positions were considered serious business. The Ottoman tradition, drawing from Galenic and Islamic sources, recommended sleeping on the right side with the right hand beneath the cheek. This position was said to aid digestion, calm the heartbeat, and, according to belief, prevent disturbing dreams. Sleeping face up was discouraged, believed to invite shallow breath and restless visions. Sleeping on the left was seen as acceptable, but only later in the night, once the body had fully relaxed. And for the sleepless, they were not told to try harder. Instead, they were given instructions to change the room. That meant opening a window, relighting a lamp, rearranging the bedding. One text even suggests whispering a verse aloud, not a spell, but a shift to signal to the body that the moment had passed and a new one was beginning. The idea was simple but profound. If the night no longer welcomes you, make it do so again. The sequence of sleep. Whereas modern medicine focuses heavily on how long we sleep, Ottoman healers emphasized when and how we entered sleep. They believed the first hour of sleep determined the quality of all that followed. If the first hour was disturbed, by noise, by cold, by argument. It tainted the entire night. So much attention was given to creating a seamless sequence from waking to rest. This sequence often mirrored the 5 elements of balance. Light fading, from oil lamps to darkness. Heat cooling, from warm food to room temperature bedding sound. Silencing, from voices to hush breath slowing. From movement to stillness, weight increasing. From clothing to the quilt. The goal was to gently step down from life into sleep, not to leap. And what about dreams? In Ottoman sleep culture, dreams were divided into 3 kinds. Empty dreams, random, meaningless, usually ignored, muddled dreams, fragments of the day, fears, or overactive digestion. True dreams, rare, vivid, and symbolic. True dreams were sometimes shared with imams or healers, who kept dream books based on centuries of pattern recognition. One such text, found in a 17th century Turkish archive, claims, "He who dreams of crossing water without wetting his feet shall soon recover from illness." Dreams were respected, not feared. Even nightmares were viewed not as punishment, but as signals that something in the body or spirit needed tending. So as this section closes, imagine that quiet room again. The quilt presses gently. The air smells faintly of roses. Somewhere beyond the walls, a servant steps softly, a lamp gutters, and the city of Constantinople exhales into night. The mind doesn't rush. The breath doesn't race. The dreams, if they come, are welcome guests, and, still, the question lingers beneath the stillness. When sleep was once treated like a prayer, what did it heal that we no longer remember? The forgotten science of soothing. As the Ottoman Empire entered its later centuries, the sleep traditions that once softened its nights began to drift. Not because they failed, but because the world got louder. The cities grew. Coffee houses multiplied. Lanterns lined the streets. Steam replaced silence. And the careful sequence of breath, scent, and weight gave way to the quickening pulse of modern life. But for a long time, centuries, in fact, the Ottomans treated sleep the way a musician handles an instrument, with precision, with care, and with a deep belief that its quality shapes everything that follows. And nowhere was this belief more visible than in the Darushifas, the hospitals of the empire. Sleep in the healing houses. These weren't hospitals in the way we imagine today. Ottoman Darushifas were equal parts treatment centers, spiritual sanctuaries, and temples of rest. Patients were not hurried between rooms. They were ushered into sleeping gardens, shaded by trees, where the air was warm and the sounds were curated. Birdsong, flowing water, gentle flute music. Sleep was not encouraged through pills or commands, but through environment. Water flowed through open channels in the walls, creating a constant hush. The walls were painted with pale colors: blue, green, ivory. Every detail was chosen for its calming effect. Physicians believed that healing the body began by calming the soul, and that no medicine worked without sleep. At night, attendants brought weighted quilts and warm drinks, sometimes spiced milk, sometimes barley tea. They would speak to patients in soft tones, tell them stories, or recite verses to guide them towards sleep. And when a patient finally rested, especially after many wakeful nights, it was recorded as a turning point in their recovery. 1. 16th century medical record notes. On the 5th night, after the second pouring of rosewater and recitation of the 112th verse, the patient slept. Upon waking, he wept and said the pain was gone. Did the verse cure him? The rosewater? Or simply the fact that someone made space for rest? We may never know, but the result was the same. He slept, and he healed. The fade of the quilter's Ottoman culture modernized in the 19th century, adopting more Western medical models, embracing electric light, and encouraging industrial speed. The old sleep rituals began to feel outdated. Rosewater became perfume, yorgans became thinner, silence became impractical, and rest, once sacred, became optional. Some traditions clung on in rural areas. Elderly women still sewing weighted quilts by hand, still telling children to wash their feet before sleep, so the dreams won't wander. But in the cities, and eventually across the former empire, these rituals faded into memory. Still, remnants remain. In Turkish homes today, the yorgan is still common, thick, stitched by grandmothers, and stored with care. In bathhouses, rosewater is still offered for its calming scent. And in some mosques, Friday sermons still reference the importance of rest not just as health, but as worship, a gift from God that we are often too busy to receive. And perhaps that's the truth the Ottomans understood best. That sleep is not passive, not just something the body falls into when tired, but something we invite, prepare for, and protect. In their world, sleep wasn't escaped into. It was walked toward, step by step, with warmth, with ritual, and with reverence. So tonight, when the lights are low and the noise of the day begins to ebb, imagine this. A quiet room, a soft quilt, weighted just enough to remind you that you are here. A cloth soaked in rosewater pressed gently to your forehead. A breath in, a breath out. No schedule, no phone, just stillness. Not as a luxury, but as a cure. And in that stillness, consider this. If rest was once treated with the care we now give to medicine, what might happen if we return to it, one quiet night at a time?